So when a president declares a national emergency, where exactly is the line? You know, the line between protecting the state and protecting the people's rights. Well, today we're going to dive into a landmark case that put that very question right to the ultimate test.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We'll break it all down just like a legal case digest. We'll kick things off with the facts, then get into the big legal questions, and of course, walk through the court's final ruling and what it all means.
Okay, first things first, the facts. Every case starts here. And to really get this one, you've got to see it from two totally different sides. First, you have the government side of the story, what they said justified the emergency. And then, you have what people were actually experiencing on the streets. So if you were in the government at this time, things look, well, pretty explosive. It wasn't just one thing, it was a whole bunch of things happening really fast. You had these escaped mutineers calling for people to hit the streets. Then, an assassination plot, codenamed O-Plan Hackle I, supposedly gets uncovered. And maybe the most worrying part, reports that soldiers were about to break the chain of command. So for the administration, all of this pointed to a clear and present danger. They felt they had no choice but to issue Proclamation 1017. And make no mistake, this wasn't just some dusty legal document. When the presidential chief of staff comes out and says this, it sends a very clear message. Warrantless arrests, taking over the media, yeah, that's all on the table now.
And it didn't take long for that threat to become a reality. Suddenly, peaceful protests are being broken up with water cannons. A well-known professor gets arrested, no warrant. And then, in the middle of the night, police raid one newspaper and surround another one. It's these actions, right here, that became the core of the legal challenge. The people who sued argued, hey, this is a flat-out assault on our constitutional rights.
All right, so that's the setup. This clash between security and freedom landed right on the Supreme Court's doorstep, bringing with it some really fundamental questions. Now, before the court could even get to the big question, is this whole proclamation unconstitutional? They had to deal with some housekeeping stuff first. For starters, the proclamation was only in effect for a week, so is the case even relevant anymore? Then there's the question of who's suing. Do they actually have the right to? This is a legal idea called locus standi, and it basically asks, were you personally and directly harmed? And finally, can the court even question the president's reasons for declaring the emergency in the first place? They had to get past all of these questions just to get to the main event.
Okay, on to the ruling. And this is where it gets really interesting. The court didn't just give a simple thumbs up or thumbs down. Nope. What they did was more like legal surgery. They took out a scalpel and very precisely separated what the president could do from what she absolutely couldn't.
So here's the bottom line. The court drew a super clear line in the sand. Declaring a national emergency? Sure. Calling out the military to stop violence? You got it. That's constitutional. But, and this is a huge but, the proclamation tried to do way more than that. It essentially let the president act like Congress, take over private media, and order arrests without the proper legal process. And the court said, absolutely not. All of that got struck down.
And the whole decision really came down to this core philosophy, which the Chief Justice put perfectly. Think of it like this. When it comes to a person's liberty versus the government's power, the scales of justice start tipped in favor of the person. Anytime the government tries to limit your basic rights, the law assumes that action is invalid unless the government can prove it's absolutely necessary.
All right, so now let's dig into the why, the rationale. This is the court's reasoning, and they didn't just pull this out of thin air. They went through the proclamation piece by piece to explain exactly why some parts were okay and others not so much.
First up, this thing called the calling out power. The court basically looked at all the government's reports and said, okay, yeah, things are getting chaotic. The Constitution gives the president, as commander-in-chief, the power to call out the military to deal with lawless violence. So that part of the proclamation? Totally legit. Solid constitutional ground.
But then there was the part about taking over private businesses like media companies. The court pointed out a super important detail. The Constitution says the state can do this in an emergency, but state doesn't just mean the president, it means the government. And the power to authorize something that drastic, that belongs to Congress through a law. The president can't just snap her fingers and do it herself.
And this is where we hit a bedrock principle of democracy, the separation of powers. See, the proclamation mentioned enforcing decrees promulgated by me. That was a huge red flag for the court. Why? Because making laws or decrees is Congress's job, period. Even in an emergency, the president doesn't get a blank check to start writing their own laws. It's a crucial check on power.
So this case was bigger than just this one proclamation. It ended up reinforcing some really important legal principles. Think of them as guardrails that keep our democracy on the track, especially when things get bumpy.
The first guardrail is all about who can even bring a case to court. Normally, you need something called locus standing, standing. Think of it this way. You can't sue someone for denting your neighbor's car. It wasn't your car, so you weren't directly harmed. You need to have a personal stake in the outcome.
But here, the court said, we're making an exception. Why? Because the issues at stake, things like presidential power, freedom of speech, the right to protest, were of what they called transcendental importance. This is a really big deal. It means that when the issues are so fundamental to the health of the nation, the court can let ordinary citizens and groups bring the case, because a threat to those rights is a threat to everyone.
And here's another really smart move by the court. They use something called an as-applied challenge. It's a way of looking not just at the law on paper, but how it was actually used in the real world. So they could say, look, the president's basic power to declare an emergency is constitutional, but the way that power was applied on the streets, the warrantless arrests, the newspaper raid, that was totally illegal. It's a way to fix the problem without throwing the whole tool out.
All right, so after all that legal wrangling, what was the final verdict? Let's get to the disposition, the court's final official word.
And here it is, laid out plain and simple. The president's power to call in the military to stop violence, that was valid. But the parts that let her act like a one-person legislature, issue decrees or take over private companies without a law from Congress, all void. And those specific actions, like the warrantless arrests and the raid on the Daily Tribune, declared flat out illegal. So in the end, the court upheld the power to respond to a crisis, but it slammed the door shut on any attempt to overstep constitutional boundaries.
You know, this ruling from 2006 is still so incredibly relevant. It's a masterclass in that constant balancing act between security and liberty. And it leaves us with a really important question, one that never goes away. When the next crisis hits, are we going to remember where that line is drawn?